Bundy was one of the architects of this. I think, Gordon, you're about as critical as one could be, yet be nice about it, of McGeorge Bundy's performance in 1964 as the National Security Advisor to Johnson. Would you please elaborate on what you think he didn't do that he should have used the year 1994 to do?
There was no decision on Vietnam in 1964 to escalate. There was no decision in 1964 to resolve. There was very little fertility of imagination about what we would do and when we would do it if we stayed. There was a discussion of and rejection of the possibility of neutralization, which is what happened in Laos. The large powers convened and made a formal agreement to neutralize Laos. It would neither be a Western nor a communist state. It would be neutral. And as I reflected on the missed opportunity of 1964, it became clear to me that there was a chance for Bundy to compose an EXCOM for the Vietnam War. The EXCOM, or Executive Committee, was the apparatus that gamed out the different scenarios in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It could have been established for Vietnam, and it could have been established early in 1964 because everyone knew no major decision was going to be made until after that election. And it could have tested every assumption about escalation. It could have tested the viability of any conceivable American military strategy. It could have been used to rigorously examine whether bombing would work. It could have been used as a laboratory to develop really seriously developed scenarios for the president to examine after the election when he would have to make decisions about Vietnam. But that opportunity wasn't grasped, and I think it was a missed opportunity.
They never considered, did they, how many American soldiers it might take?
It's fascinating. When the ultimate decisions were made, they were made in a series of ad hoc troop escalations. There was not a probing study of what it would take to win in South Vietnam. But there were studies of what would happen with bombing, and there were studies of what would happen with the so-called Domino theory. And both of those studies took senior decision makers in the opposite direction of their basic assumptions. In 1964, there were two military exercises conducted. One was called Sigma 1, and the other was called Sigma 2. These were simulations of what would happen if the United States initiated a strategic bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The assumption at that point was that you could coerce the government in Hanoi to stop supporting the insurgency in the South. And the assumption was that bombing was the means to do it. But these war games showed clearly that the opposite result would occur. Rather than diminishing the will of Hanoi, this would harden their will. Rather than diminishing the strength of the insurgency, this would propel it. This would enlarge it. Sigma 2, the second of these war games, was one in which Bundy himself participated as one of the most senior civilian leaders to examine how bombing would play out. It was a simulation supervised by the head of the social science department at West Point. It was really serious business. And the results were, in essence, ignored. There was also an intelligence finding in 1964 that was subsequently known as the death of the Domino theory memorandum, because it tested the premises of the Domino theory, the expectation that if we lost in South Vietnam, that the entire region of Southeast Asia would fall under communist control. And it disputed those findings. That wasn't examined.
Would it be fair to say, Gordon, that these guys just didn't want to hear it? That they just didn't want to hear, they didn't want to take account of the Sigma studies, the death of the Domino theory study, which I had not known about before, the study showing that bombing would harden the North Vietnamese as a result. They just didn't want to hear it. They had, I mean, the question I'm asking is, has two parts. One, is it true they just didn't want to hear it? And two, if they just didn't want to hear it, was it partly because the country in general, and they in particular, we're in the midst of the Cold War psychosis where we just have to fight them all the time, everywhere?
I think the answer to that is somewhere in understanding the pathology of bureaucratic politics and group decision-making. But it was clear that men like Bundy, who had already come to a basic determination and had a firm conviction that to fight in Vietnam was critically important to defending the national interest, that these studies were almost irrelevant to a conviction that was already clearly established in his own mind. We must show that when we make a commitment, our commitment is real and that we're willing to pay the cost for that commitment. So to preserve that credibility, Bundy was prepared to fight a war that he didn't necessarily think we could win, to fight a war that he didn't necessarily think was in American interest, but to even send in, as you alluded to earlier in our conversation, send in 100,000 men and lose, because the outcome would be marginally better to show that we were prepared to pay the cost.
Wasn't that almost, in retrospect at least, in retrospect, that's a bad joke, huh? Wasn't that almost an immoral theory? When you consider how many men today, after we lost 58,000 dead in Vietnam, were so bitter at McNamara because we had gotten into a war without an intent to win as some people see it. I mean, we'll discuss the attrition theory of winning, but we were not going to do many of the things that might have contributed to success, and men died by the scores of thousands for that. Lord, you could say this was immoral of Bundy to say, well, we'll put in 100,000, lose what we lose, at least the rest of the world will know we are credible people. We will stand behind our commitments. There's a certain lack of morality in that, isn't there?
I was startled by that particular fragment, and I puzzled over it for a long time to try to put it into a broader context so that I could understand what Bundy was thinking in 1965 and to contrast that what he thought 30 years later when we collaborated on our book. And he traveled an enormous distance between those 2 points in time. There is embedded in every proposal to escalate in Vietnam of the period of 61 through 65, all of the serious military proposals. One theme that recurs again and again, and that is the theme of how to apply military power. And in this case, the expectation was that if we imposed enough pain on the insurgents, if we imposed enough pain on North Vietnam, that you could demonstrate to the adversary that they could not win. And only then, when they saw that they could not win and that a terrible price would be imposed upon them, then a diplomatic negotiation would be possible. And that was the expectation. Coerce the adversary to the negotiating table and then cut a deal on terms favorable to the United States. That was the expectation as it is encapsulated in the various proposals to send in ground combat forces and prior to that to initiate strategic bombing. And it was an utterly misguided assumption. But it was the assumption that drove so many of the decisions.
Now, I think in the book you point out that was an unexamined assumption. At least I would say, having lived through this, I thought it was an unexamined assumption because at the time we thought, I have to say, very much like in 2003 and 4 and 5, that American military power was so great as to be irresistible. And if we just ratchet it up, sooner or later, Ho will get the word. You know, one thing I have to say for Johnson, I didn't know, and believe me, I don't want to say anything for Johnson, but I learned in your book, I had not known this before, that Johnson understood apparently from the get-go that Ho Chi Minh was not going to be dissuaded by bombing, which is why Johnson, unlike Kennedy, or at least it's one reason why Johnson, unlike Kennedy, favored a ground war and decided to Americanize the war in 1965. How do you think Johnson came to the conclusion? How was he shrewd enough when none of all these brilliant advisors, I mean, we talked about how brilliant Bundy, the preeminent intellectual of his generation, and I would say that Robert McNamara had to give him a good run for the money because he's a brilliant man.
It was a gut thing for Johnson. He would say, "Old Ho ain't going to give in to no bombs," and that was his belief. And when the pivotal decisions came in 1965, it is absolutely remarkable to me to see the sequence of events from initiating bombing to ground combat forces. And again, Bundy is one of the central protagonists in this drama. February 65, he goes to Vietnam. He goes to play coup. There's the attack. On the plane ride back, they develop their proposal for bombing. The proposal for bombing does not anticipate the added need for base security to protect the military installations from which airstrikes would be launched. These would obviously become very high-value military targets, and they would need to be reinforced, and they would need to be reinforced with ground combat forces. Bundy's proposal is silent on this. General William Westmoreland...
Do you think he even realized this?
It's one of the questions that I was never able to answer. General William Westmoreland immediately pounces on this oversight and says, we're going to have to significantly increase the troop presence to protect these air bases once airstrikes are initiated. And there is an intense and angry debate between Westmoreland, who's the top military commander, and General Max Taylor, who had been Kennedy's private military advisor and had been sent to South Vietnam as ambassador. And it's remarkable to read how prescient Taylor was. He says to Bundy and to the president, don't do this. This is the first increment of what will be an ever widening and growing demand for American ground combat forces. That if you cross that line, you'll never go back. Don't do it. This has been our policy all along to not deploy ground combat forces. We can't break that policy here.
And you got to protect the people who are protecting the base, and pretty soon you go out and you're searching.
And you expand the perimeter, and you liberalize the rules of engagement, and all of a sudden you've got a ground war on your hands.
Do you think this is what, or is this what Halberstam meant in The Best and the Brightest? I think it was, but somewhere where he said, and you quote him or discuss him, once you start listening to the military, once you start combat, the military's idea will take over because it's just a matter of logic. If you're going to have an air base, you got to protect it. If you're going to have people protecting the perimeter, you got to protect them, and so on and so forth. But I mean, this is an example of what Halberstam was talking about, isn't it?
I think it is, and it also underscores how military conditions themselves will dictate what your strategy will be rather than how your strategy is going to define military conditions.
And you know what, one can't avoid wondering whether we're doing the same thing in Afghanistan today, because now that conventional warfare has failed in Afghanistan, on the day that we're taping this, which is, I don't know, what is this, May 12th? Now we're gonna change our strategy. We've got we put in a new general. We're gonna do more of the anti-guerrilla warfare type thing, and you just can't help wondering whether Obama, like Johnson before him and Kennedy too, perhaps, is temporizing, and is listening to ideas which are just going to suck us in further and further. And as I say, is temporizing because he doesn't want to harm the rest of his program, which was really a big part of the story about Johnson, was it not?
You know, the parallels between Vietnam and Afghanistan are truly striking and truly troubling. I don't know the way out of Afghanistan. We've been there for 7 years, and we've been unsuccessful in our effort to eradicate the Taliban and bring stability to that country. But both in Vietnam and in Afghanistan, you have a large neighboring country that supports and reinforces an insurgency. In both Vietnam and Afghanistan, we have essentially a corrupt or incompetent client government in power. In both of these cases, we are not fighting a conventional war. We're fighting an insurgency, which we are the least well poised to prevail in. than in any other form of military conflict. And in both of these situations, we now confront a potentially diminishing basis of political support here and internationally for a conflict that doesn't seem to have any discernible endpoint in sight. So it really is an extremely difficult problem.
Today I'm announcing a comprehensive new strategy for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And this marks the conclusion of a careful policy review led by Bruce that I ordered as soon as I took office. My administration's heard from our military commanders as well as our diplomats. We've consulted with the Afghan and Pakistani governments, with our partners and our NATO allies, and with other donors and international organizations. We've also worked closely with members of Congress here at home. And now I'd like to speak clearly and candidly to the American people. The situation is increasingly perilous. It's been more than 7 years since the Taliban was removed from power, yet war rages on. Insurgents control parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Attacks against our troops, our NATO allies, and the Afghan government have risen steadily. And most painfully, 2008 was the deadliest year of the war for American forces.
You said at lunch that you feel, this truly resonated with me, you feel that we keep making the same mistakes. One thing that I thought was astonishingly striking in your description of Bundy's views was that he seemed not to care about the enemy's capabilities and reactions in deciding what to do and giving advice. My question, how can a guy who was supposed to be so bright have made such a fundamental mistake, if I understand correctly what I read, as not to be concerned with the enemy's capabilities and intentions?
What I've tried to do with my book is look at Bundy's particular perspective and role, both then and retrospectively. And the best answer I can come up with to your question is that the man who looked back at his decisions 3 decades earlier was a fundamentally different man than made those decisions. As we've discussed previously, the persona of Bundy in power is of a man of arrogance and hubris and overconfidence.
Something Lincoln once said that, not very widely known, went something like this. This nation could be invaded by all the armies of Europe led by Napoleon, and they would never water their horses in the Ohio. And the people in Vietnam and now some people in Afghanistan used to say something like that. In 20 years, you'll be gone, but we'll still be here.
And this was precisely the message that one of Bundy's top aides on the National Security Council, a man named Jim Thompson, tried to communicate to Bundy in December of 1964. Bundy called him into his office and asked him to read a confidential document that described an escalation plan in Vietnam and seemed to anticipate some kind of a reprisal stimulated by a attack, and then the rapid use of overwhelming air power, and then some kind of a diplomatic effort to resolve it very quickly. It was a very incongruous and sketchy plan, yet what Thompson remembers from the meeting is the discussion they had about the efficacy of bombing. And Thompson said to Bundy, you know, Mr. Bundy, what really concerns me about this is that at the end of the day, the Vietnamese know that we're not going to stay there and that we will leave, yet they have no place to go. And over time, isn't that going to work against us? And Bundy absorbed this and was silent for a moment and said, well, that's a very interesting point, Jim. Thank you very much.
You know, I just read another thing very similar in a New York Review of Books, and a review of some books by Benny Morris, the Israeli historian. And one of the ideas alleged to be in part responsible for the outcome of the 1948 war, where the Israelis defeated the Arab armies is the Israelis had nowhere else to go. It was that or the sea. So, you know, right into the sea. So when you're fighting somebody who says, where am I going to go? I'm going to have to be here in 50 years or be dead, one of the two. Boy, that's a tough business. And you know, you talked about his arrogance back in those days. I had a sense, Gordon, that's why they blew off George Ball all the time and contented themselves, and this is so human. You see this in meetings all the time. You content yourself with destroying the other guy's argument, never considering whether your argument may be worth a darn. I have a sense that happened here, and I have a sense it's partly due to arrogance and conceit.
And what happened in that meeting was dispiriting to Ball and tragic, really, for the outcome in Vietnam. What could have been an honest debate about the limitations of military strategy in Vietnam devolved into a 3-against-1 attack in which Rusk, Bundy, and McNamara didn't address the shortcomings of their own arguments. They addressed the shortcomings of Ball's proposal for some kind of face-saving diplomatic scenario to mitigate the damage in Vietnam. They put him in the position of having to explain why his proposal would succeed rather than defending why their proposals for escalation would be valid. And this was symptomatic of the way decision-making was conducted in the Johnson administration. They didn't necessarily look at the viability of their own proposals. They looked at the cost of pursuing alternative courses of action like diplomacy.
You look at one side, you ignore the other side. You know, there's what should be a famous statement of American history, but is largely forgotten. I remember when the former Marine Commandant David Shoup went before Congress during Vietnam, and as part of the same type of skepticism that you talk about being directed at Ball in that meeting, the Congress people said to him, well, General Shoup, how are you going to withdraw the troops from Vietnam? And Shoup said, by ship and by plane. Nobody wanted to hear the simple truths about things, you know. When those people were attacking Ball, I take it that in that meeting, I take it that then and really not for years afterwards, if ever during the war itself, did we realize that we had consigned ourselves because of the limitations we placed on ourselves to a war of attrition, which I'd like you to elaborate. I will say that I know of no time in American history except Grant's overland campaign where the enemy was already on the ropes pretty much, or was ripe to be put on the ropes. I think that's the sole exception I know of where America won a campaign of attrition. This was a war of attrition, as you describe it, which, of course, we're going to lose a war of attrition, given our view about humanity and the sanctity of life and the fact we're fighting 10,000 miles away. But maybe you could explain why it became, or what made it a war of attrition.
The consequence of fighting a war of attrition, a series of skirmishes with small numbers of men rather than large fixed campaigns and fixed battles, was that over time we did grind down the enemy's capacities. We did grind down their numbers. Bundy calculated that we imposed an order of magnitude of losses on the enemy exponentially greater than those we ourselves suffered, something in the area of about 100 to 1 per capita. Yet the irony is, rather than the adversary quitting the field of battle, exhausted because of this attrition, we were the ones who quit the field of battle after years of combat, exhausted by a war of attrition.
It is my understanding that to fight a war that was not a war of attrition, we would have to invade North Vietnam and go to Hanoi. And that, of course, risked entry by the Chinese, not to mention the Russians possibly, by air at least. And of course, we never considered that the North Vietnamese were being resupplied by factories that were located in sanctuaries, that is to say, China and Russia. So if you're not going to go north, lest the Chinese come in again as they did in Korea, and you can't cut off the weapons, what is left but a war of attrition?
And this is something that needed to be gamed out and clearly articulated for the benefit of the president and his top advisors when they decided to escalate in 1965, because it was a clearly obvious scenario that we would confront. Look at all the things that they took off the table. Diplomacy was taken off the table. The senior decision makers believed that this was much like the Korean War and that we had to go in and make a stand. There was an expectation that we would not invade North Vietnam for the reasons that you mentioned. It would trigger China's entry into the war. We would continue to confront the problem of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lines of communication and resupply from North Vietnam into South Vietnam.
We wish to emphasize we seek no wider war. Our response will depend upon the action of the aggressors, in this case, the North Vietnamese. The key to the situation remains the cessation of infiltration from the north into the south.
And I think you had asked me in a previous conversation, do you think 100 years from now, Lyndon Johnson will be remembered more for one of his great achievements, the Civil Rights Act, or more for Vietnam? I think he'll be remembered more for Vietnam than for any of his legislative victories, as important as they are, because I think they would have evolved over time. But Vietnam was a war of choice, not a war of necessity, and that's how Lyndon Johnson will be remembered.
Interesting. They would have evolved over time. And isn't it a shame that even though they would have evolved over time, he certainly speeded them up, and there'd be no Obama today were there not the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65, and yet, you think with obvious reason behind your thought that he will be remembered more for Vietnam than for his civil rights work. Shows how shockingly terrible the situation and the times were.